Hello everyone, I am Fuad Alabi, and in this video I'm going to talk about global exception handling for our project. In this video we are going to cover the best practices that we can use using action filter, use exception handler, and use a middleware. And I'm going to talk about how to generate a response and what is the standard for web API exceptions. Let's start with the best practices that we have. We can use action filters, we can use exception handler, and we can use middleware. I'm going to discuss the difference between them, but before doing that, you need to understand what is a request lifecycle. Request lifecycle consists of different middlewares. The first middleware will get the request, execute some code, and then call the next middleware and pass the request to the next middleware. The next middleware does exactly the same thing, execute a code and call the next one and pass the request to the next one, and eventually the last middleware, which we can assume it is run middleware, not use middleware, is going to generate the response for us and return back the response to the middleware which called it, and that middleware can execute some code on the response, and it is going to pass it to the previous one, pass to the previous one, and finally we are going to pass the response to the user who sent the request. But it is not a big deal, because if I want to explain it a bit easier, middlewares are just wrappers around each other. We have the first middleware here. It is going to get the request. It will execute some lines of code that we have, and now it is going to call the next middleware. You can think about middlewares like functions that you can call inside your code. This method, middleware 1, I'm just calling them method for the sake of the learning, but they are not methods. But you can imagine that middleware 1 is a method running some codes and then call the second method inside itself. And that method has some codes and can call another method. And finally, the last method is going to execute everything for me. And after the execution of this method is completed, the compiler will goes back to the place which called it and call the rest of the code, call the rest of the code, call the rest of the code, and send the output, as you can see it here. Then middlewares are just some wrappers. I do not use action filters, because if I want to talk about action filters are just some wrappers around the place that we are generating our response. We usually generate the response inside the controller in 99% of the times. And action filters are just wrapper before and after the controller or action method execution. Then what will happen if something goes wrong here or here? We cannot handle those exceptions, because the exception handling that we designed is just wrapping my action method and controller. Then in this video, I'm not going to talk about action filters. What I like to talk about is use exception handler. This use exception handler should be registered as the first middleware. And by registering it at the first middleware, it will get executed before and after executing all the code. You can imagine that all these codes are wrapped and get executed here. Then, if I have control over it before and after the execution, it is fine. I can put it inside a try catch and get the exception and handle it in just one place. We have exactly the same mechanism for using a custom middleware. I'm going to cover them both. There is no really big difference between them, but we need to cover them both. And finally, we need to know how to generate the response when we are facing an error or an exception. We can create a custom JSON response, or we can use problem detailed response, which is a standard for web APIs. Let's go to code and see how it works. For this session, I just changed the log level for default and ASP.NET Core to errors, because I'm going to show you how this error is getting logged by use exception handler. Let's check the exceptions that we are generating. Here, if I go to core, inside core, I have my application and I have a folder for exception. I'm throwing two exceptions, bad request, which I'm passing some messages to it, And then we have a dictionary for the validation errors, for example, for email or postal code. Oh, this one should be public fine. And I have another exception, not found. As an example, when we are editing or deleting something, if we cannot find something to delete and edit, we need to throw this exception. And there might be some other exceptions that I'm not aware of them, and .NET by itself is going to throw an exception, and we need to handle them. Let me run my application and see how it works first. If I go to post and try to execute my code, I need to see some exceptions, but it is not the exception that I expected, because it is say the validator create member request validator contains asynchronous rule. Okay, do we need to share these details with the user? Because hackers will kill themselves to realize how your code is going to work. I'm just letting them know the line number of my code, the code structure that I have, and so many other things. I'm not going to let them know anything about my stack trace. But let me go back to code and fix this one first. It is not an error that I designed. It is something that I missed during the implementation. In the member command and then create member, we have the member request handler. Inside the member request handler in the previous session, we add something for checking if the entity is unique or not. And we are running it asynchronously. Then here inside the handler, instead of calling the validate method, I need to change it to validate async and await it. Okay, fine. Now if I go back to Swagger and try to run it again, I expect to get something went wrong or bad request or something like that, because I cannot remember what was the message. Yeah, something went wrong, but it is still showing me some information that I don't want to share with my end user. Then how to do that? The first approach is going to the program.cs file and register a middleware. Use exception handler, and I need to pass a route to it, because eventually we need to have a route, and in that route we are going to generate a response and show it to our user. Let's call it errors. Fine, and let's check what it does for me. It adds a middleware to the pipeline and catches the exception. Fine, then log them. Reset the request path and re-execute the request. It is resetting the request path, which means that we don't need to specify any HTTP verb for it. I just need to create one controller here, and let's call it errors controller. It needs to inherit from controller base and public action result errors. Yeah, and the route should be errors. Let me check it just to being sure that I'm not misspelling anything here. Yeah, it is fine. And now let's just return okay for now, to not facing any kind of build errors. How we are going to handle the exception? The first thing that we need to do is getting the exception. To do that, I need to get the HTTP context, because inside the HTTP context we have some features, and one of those features is exception handler. By getting that feature, I can have access to the exception, the path that exception happens, and so many information about that. Var exception handler equal HTTP context.features.get, and I exception handler feature is something that I want to get. And then let me extract the exception inside the exception variable. Good. And now I have access to my exception. Now I can return a JSON result and just print out the message that we have inside our exception. Then let's do it like JSON result, new error message, and get the exception. I need to new it as well, and let's reformat everything. Okay, it is fine. Let me go back to Swagger and see how it works. If I just press F5, it is working, but it is weird because I'm expecting to have an error. Let me rebuild my code again. I'm rebuilding my code here and expect to get an error. Let's wait for it. Yeah, failed to load the API definition, because we are using Swagger, and Swagger expect that if we have anything from type controller, it should have HTTP verb like get, put, post, and delete. But here we don't have it, and we don't really need it. The only reason that I might need to add HTTP verb to it is for Swagger to get executed. But I don't want it. I can just here, decorate my controller with API Explorer setting ignore API to true. And if I save it and check my console again, it is successful. And here I can execute my request again and get the error. Now I'm returning an error with status 500 and something went wrong. But is it a good response? I don't think so, because your end user is not aware of the format of the response. If error happens, then we need to use a standard. The standard that we need to use is the problem detail for HTTP APIs. As you can see here, it is not a new thing. This standard established in 2016, but this version of the standard is deprecated, as you can see here, obsoleted by RFC 9457. If I go to this RFC, it is for problem details API. You can see it here, the format that we need to have. It is an example. We are posting something. The content type for the post request is application.json. And we are trying to do something, maybe add something or delete something. And here is the response. We have the code. Yeah, it is the status code. And we have the content type, which is application problem.json. Then the content type should be problem.json instead of JSON. And we have type, title, detail, and instance. These four properties are some mandatory property that you should return to the end user and to the client. And after that, we have some extensions. Extensions are some more information that you want to return back to your user. The type should be a link that explains to human that what happened. As an example, if your client tries to delete something which doesn't exist, you need to have one link for it and specify in that link that what happened, what doesn't exist, why it is happening, and it should be human readable. Then we have a title, we have a detail. In the detail, you need to specify exactly that what was the value and why it went wrong, and you need to describe how user can just resolve it. And in the instance, you should return back the path that exception happened there. As an example, in my Swagger, I'm sending a request to API/member. Then I need to return it back to user as well. But how to do that? For generating that in .NET Core, we have another action result, which is called problem. And the problem is going to generate the problem detail format for me and return it back to the client. Now, if I go back to the Swagger and just try to run it, you will see that the error that I see here is from the type application problem.json, not application JSON anymore, and it has type, title, status, and the trace ID. The status here and the status code here are exactly the same thing. We have a type here, and I explained to you that this type should be a human readable explanation about what went wrong. It is explaining that error 500 or internal server error is something like that. We have an explanation for that, and you don't need to create it. It is something that I really like. And by changing the status code as an example here to not found, if I run my code again, I will get another response code and I will get another type. As you can see here, the status code is 404, the status here is 404, and the title and the type are generated for me. If I go to this one, it is not referring to the internal server error anymore. It is referring to not found. And the other thing that I really like is that we have a trace ID here, and this trace ID is generated for me because when something goes wrong inside my code, it is logging the exception for me, as you can see it here. Then using this trace ID, I can find the log later and realize what went wrong in my code. Let's go back to code and see how can I add some more information to it. I have a status code that I can pass. Let me check what are the other things that I can pass here. I can pass detail, instance, status code, title, and type. And as I told you, based on the status code, the title and type will get generated for me. But what if I want to return some extensions? And extensions, what I mean by extensions, if I go back to the standard, you can see that we have some other extension which explain a bit more for me. Let's go back to code and check it. As an example, here inside the create member request handler, we are passing a dictionary of validation errors to my exception, which is bad request exception, and I want to send it to user when something went wrong. But how can I pass extensions to it when I don't have any parameter for doing that? Let's go to the ASP.NET Core implementation in the GitHub. Now, as you can see, I am inside the controller base class, and inside the controller base class, I can find the problem. Yeah, it is the problem function that I have. It doesn't accept the extension, but here it is going to call another thing with extension. Okay, I don't get it. Why I don't have access to it? I can use this part of code. It is going to check if the problem detail factory is null, it is just generating a problem detail. But if it is not null, it is going to use the problem detail factory to create the problem detail. And I guess this problem detail factory is responsible for matching the status code with a list of titles and types behind the scene and return it to me. Then it is something that I like to have, and I want to copy it and paste it inside my code here and use this one instead of using the original problem action result. Let's change it to my problem and change this one to, and rename this one to my problem as well. It shouldn't be virtual, and I don't want to pass a strings to it. I want to pass a problem detail instance or object to it, and let me call it problem. Controller base is using the problem detail factory. Then I can be sure that it is getting registered somewhere. Then I can inject it to my code. Let's type ctor tab and inject problem detail factory, call it problem detail, and create a field for it. And there is something wrong with my code. Yes, I missed one curly braces, and now it should be fine. Yeah, I need to rename this one as well. I need to pass a problem to my problem action result. Then let's create a problem here where problem new problem detail, and then instance should be equal exception handler dot path, and the details should be exception dot message, and the status should be internal server error. Based on the exception that I'm receiving, I'm going to change it inside a switch, but the instance and detail should be like that. And as you can see, I'm getting the path from the exception handler. Let's create the switch, and based on the exceptions that we have, generate the status code and the extensions. Case bad request exception, bad request. Let's break it and create the not found exception as well. And here I need to create one for each var validation error in the bad request exception dot errors, and I'm going to add to the exception validation error key and validation error dot values. And the status code here should be internal server error. For the default should be internal server error, and for this one it should be not found. Let me just remove this line because I have it inside the default. And now that I have my problem, I can pass it to my method. Now it is time to edit my method. I am pretty sure that I have the problem factory because I'm injecting that. Then I don't need this if and else, and I have my extension here. Then I don't need this one because I have my extensions. The only thing that I want this problem detail factory to generate for me is the type and title. Then I'm going to pass the status code to it, which is my problem dot status. And let's format it again. And here I am just trying to pass the problem. And now I want to assign the type and the title that this problem detail factory generated for me to the problem that I passed here. Okay, problem dot type equal problem details dot type, and problem dot title should be problem detail dot title. And I have a misspelling here. Let me correct it. It should be problem. Let's go to the Swagger and see what is the result. I want to create a member and send a post request. By sending that, I'm getting internal server error. The detail is something went wrong. The status code is 500. The title is generated for me, and I have this type as well. The instance is API member, exactly the address that I'm sending my request, and I have some extensions as well. Email must have a correct format, and postal code must be 7 characters. And if I change it to, for example, email to empty and execute it again, it is showing me another validation error as well. Email is required. Now let's just use the second approach, which is creating a middleware. Let me create a folder, and inside that I want to create a class. This class is called ExceptionHandler Middleware. Middlewares in .NET Core doesn't have interface. There is middleware interface, but it is not really for middlewares. It is for request delegates. In the playlist that I'm creating about ASP.NET Core in details, I'm explaining it in more details. But for now, just be careful. When you are creating a middleware, it should follow a pattern. And the pattern is that you need to have a method called invoke async. And in that invoke async method, you need to call the next request delegate. Then you need to have one constructor, and the constructor should accept a request delegate, and let's call it next, because inside your method you need to call it public async task invoke async, and you need to pass HTTP context to it, because we are passing requests from one middleware to another one, and then we need to call the next middleware here. It is one simple middleware. But if I want to use my middleware to handle the errors, I need to wrap it between a try-catch block, something like that. Try-catch. And here, instead of throw, I'm going to handle it. Let's call it exception and just format the code. It is almost the same thing that we did inside our the implementation is almost the same as what we did inside the controller. I'm not going to waste your time by implementing this handle exception async. I have the code, and let me paste it here. I need to create a problem and assign the instance and detail as I did it in the previous class. I need to have a switch case. In this switch case, I'm just setting the status codes and I'm setting the extensions. And finally, I'm using my ProblemDetailFactory, create a problem and assign the title and type to the problem that I have, and then generate one object result out of it. I have an error here. It is about this problem detail. Let me inject it to my code here. Yes, it should be ProblemDetailFactory. Let's call it problem detail, and it should be implemented like that. Now my code is ready to run. I have JSON convert here. Let me install the dependency. Let's go back to the code and just add the using. As you can see here, I'm generating one object result class and pass the problem to it. It is going to wrap this problem and generate the response for me. And I need to pass the status to it directly. Now that I have my result, I need to use http context.response.writeAsync and write this result. But I cannot use writeAsync to write result. I need to serialize this result, not the result, the value of the result, and generate a string. And then I can pass this string to writeAsync. You might say that we have writeAsJSON async method here as well. You are 100% correct. But if you use that as a part of write as JSON async method, it is going to change the content type for you to application.json. But I need to have a content type of application-problem plus JSON. It should be application. Yeah, and it is the reason that I cannot use write as JSON async. Now it is time to just go to the program.cs file, comment out this UseExceptionHandler and write app.useMiddelware and pass this middleware to the list of the middlewares that I have inside my pipeline, and it should be the first one inside my pipeline. Before running the code, let's go back to this middleware that I have. I forgot to await it. I need to await next because the next one is asynchronous execution and I need to await it, otherwise it won't work correctly. Let's go back to the Swagger and try to post something and create a member, and let's see if the result is the same or not. Yes, the result is exactly the same as the thing that I wanted. And if I just want to delete something to check if not found exception is generated correctly or not, let me try to delete item number maybe 10 because I'm pretty sure that I don't have it inside my database. It is generating a response for me of type not found with a status code 404, and the detail is item 10 was not found, the instance, and there is no extension here that we can show to the end users. Okay, it was all I prepared for today's video. It is up to you to select and choose one of these approaches. I personally use UseExceptionHandler in my code, but not the way that I implemented that one, because I personally like to inject my own ProblemDetailsFactory to the services and use that one. But it is something for the other playlist that I prepared for you about ASP.NET Core in details. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And by hitting the bell, you will get notified when I upload a new video. Enjoy your life as a developer and keep practicing.